I'm going to finish by saying just a few things about Augustine of Hippo. Some people say Augustine. Some people say Augustine. Sometimes I say them just whatever I'm feeling like. I'll just say Augustine or Augustine. I think usually it's Augustine. Augustine is in a category of men that we call church fathers. The church fathers are those who came after Christ's apostles to lead the church, and then in the successive centuries. They defended the faith. People you see on the left there, Justin Martyr, that we talked about earlier. They defended the faith. They wrote about how to think about God and Christ. Some of the richest, earliest writings of the church come from these men we call church fathers. Excuse me. And they're categorized in different ways. Sometimes they're categorized as by their role, whether they were apologists or teachers or theologians. Sometimes they're categorized by the language they wrote in. You'll hear about the Greek fathers and the Latin fathers. Augustine is a Latin father. He wrote in Latin. Sometimes they're categorized by the time period. Some scholars speak of ante-Nicene, which means they were before, not against the Nicene. They were before the Council of Nicaea. And then you have Nicene and post-Nicene fathers, those who wrote during and after the Council of Nicaea. There's different ways of categorizing these guys. The study of the church fathers and their writings is called patristics, from the Latin pater, father. So the study of the church fathers is patristics. Without doubt, the most important, influential church father of ancient Christianity is Augustine of Hippo. So who is Augustine of Hippo? Well, because he's the most famous and influential, you may have heard his life story, but I'll just go over a few points of it very quickly. Augustine was from North Africa. His father was a pagan. He was not a Christian. Augustine's mother was somewhat famous herself. Her name was Monica. She was a devoted Christian lady, and she prayed for her son throughout his life, throughout her life. And he attributes his conversion and his salvation in large degree to her prayers. So she's the other side of this story. She's the great woman behind this great man. Augustine was very intelligent. From a young age, his parents saw that, and they got him the best training they could to study philosophy and oratory, rhetoric. That was considered sort of the pinnacle of education, was to be able to not just think well, but to speak well. And so Augustine was trained in philosophy and rhetoric, and he became a rhetoric teacher himself at a young age. The problem was that the thing that troubled his mother especially was that he had a lot of temptation to sensuality, and he had a lot of illicit relationships. In fact, he fathered an illegitimate son. So on the one hand, he's a very intelligent man, but he struggled with immorality. He also wasn't willing to become a Christian, even though his mother wanted him to. At some point, when he was a young adult, Augustine traveled from North Africa to Italy, where he thought he would find some willing students to learn rhetoric from him in the city of Milan. He was disappointed there. The students were just as stubborn and ornery as they had been in North Africa, in Milan. But what he did find in Milan was he started to listen to a great orator named Ambrose, who was the Christian bishop of Milan. So first he listened to Ambrose because he was a great orator. But then he started to be won over by Ambrose's Christianity. And he had struggled with the Christian faith before. He had tried some other beliefs. He was what's called a Manichaean for a while. Manichaeans also saw the body as evil. But eventually, Augustine came to a crisis point because he felt Christianity was true. He wanted to become a Christian, but he could not bring himself to convert. He loved the pleasures of the flesh, and at the same time, he was frustrated with his own weakness in the flesh. And he famously came to this point of crisis. He was in a friend's courtyard, and he was trying to figure out what he was going to do. And he says he heard a voice, the voice of a child playing a game across a hedge. And the child said, "Pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read it." And Augustine said he'd never heard of this game where a kid says, "Pick it up and read." But there was a Bible in front of him, so he thought maybe this is a sign from God. So he picked up the Bible and read, and he opened to this passage, Romans 13. These verses struck him like a thunderbolt. Romans 13 and 14. "Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." That was a turning point for Augustine, and he decided to become a Christian and submit himself to Christ, to put on Christ and put off immorality. And he did. He then traveled back to North Africa, where he lived as kind of a monk. He vowed celibacy. Before that, he was baptized by Ambrose. Ambrose is a famous church father himself. Augustine traveled. He returned to North Africa. He led a somewhat monastic life. Then he was made the bishop of Hippo, which was a city in what's now Algeria. And for the rest of his life, for several decades, he was the bishop of Algeria. Very quickly, let me mention something about church leadership. In the first few decades of the church, the terms elder and bishop were used interchangeably, as they seem to be used in the New Testament by Paul. But within 100 years, there was a threefold division of positions in the church that was understood broadly. You had deacons who served the practical needs of the church. Above them, you had elders who oversaw the church and preached. And then above them, you had a bishop who would either be a presiding figure over a single church or even a leader to supervise several churches in a city or a region. So bishops were those who supervised either one big church or several churches. Within another century, bishops who were over big cities took on higher importance than bishops who were over regions of the country, rural settings. So these metropolitan bishops who were over big cities like Rome or Alexandria or Constantinople, some of them took on the name patriarch. And eventually the patriarch or father or papa or pope of Rome would take on the highest status within the church. Not everyone agreed to that, but the Bishop of Rome would eventually claim that he was the authority over the entire church. So anyway, just an aside about church leadership and how that developed. So Augustine, in the 4th century, early 5th century, he was made the bishop over Hippo. So he was probably supervising several churches there. And he wrote several important texts there. His most famous is his own autobiography, which is called The Confessions of St. Augustine. And he talks about his own life, his struggles with sin. That's how we get a lot of information about his life. He also goes into a lot of philosophical passages. So much so, in fact, that even secular philosophers still read The Confessions because of his discussion of time and free will and eternity and things like that. Another thing that Augustine's known for is his opposition to Pelagius. I mentioned Pelagius the heretic earlier. Pelagius claimed that simply by doing good, we can save ourselves. And Augustine insisted against Pelagius that God must save us because we cannot save ourselves. Lastly, while Augustine was alive, his last decades of life, the Roman Empire was crumbling and falling to these Northern European tribes like the Vandals, the Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, the Lombards. And many people, their faith was shaken because here the Roman Empire had taken on Christianity as its official faith. And now it was crumbling to the attacks of these barbarians, many of whom were not Christians. And so Augustine thought this was a cause he needed to respond to. This was an issue he needed to address. And so he wrote a book called The City of God. That's his last great work. And in The City of God, Augustine explained the kingdoms of this world, no matter how much affection we attach to them, they're all going to fade. They're all going to fall. Even Rome itself, it's going to fall. And we have to put our faith in not the city of man, but the city of God, which he said, the city of God, the kingdom of God, is developing and growing within this world of man, within this city of man, but it's different. And we can't always see the boundaries between one and the other. But we must place our faith in the city of God, which is everlasting, and not be distracted by the kingdoms of this world. So that's how he made sense of the crumbling of his own civilization. In fact, when Augustine was on his deathbed, this northern European tribe called the Vandals, from which we get the word vandalism, had come into North Africa and were surrounding the city of Hippo. They would take over that part of Africa, and they would sack Rome as well. I showed you that picture of the attack of the Vandals on Rome in 455. So Augustine gives an answer to that, right? Rome is not eternal. Christ's kingdom is eternal. Why should we care about Augustine? Well, whether we agree with everything he said or not, he is the most influential thinker and church father throughout the Middle Ages and even into the period of the Reformation. And his writings are so comprehensive that different people have taken different sides of his writings and used them against others who, different thinkers use different parts of his writings to argue with one another. They'll say, well, Augustine says this, and the other person will say, no, if you read him carefully, he says this. Even into the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants will quote Augustine, and the Catholics will quote Augustine. And if you wanted to be a good scholar in the Middle Ages, you had to go through Augustine. You had to deal with his writings. And so that's why we still study him today. His mother got to see the day of his conversion and rejoice in the answers to her prayers. And he became, a monumental influence on the Christian faith. She died shortly before he left Italy. She had come over to Italy to live with him in Milan. She died shortly before he returned to Italy, to North Africa, to begin his later career.